My name is Nick Gallant from the Bartlett School of Planning, and welcome to the first of this year's lectures, public lectures run by the school. I should say that the Public Lecture Series has been operating for the last 15 years, and it provides us with an evening opportunity to bring researchers and practitioners from elsewhere in the UK and sometimes overseas to the School of Planning, to UCL, to talk about their particular research and to, I think, add to what we do here and really stimulate some debate around critical planning issues. So I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker in a moment, but the program every year comprises 5 events. This is the first of 5, and if you go online, Bartlett School of Planning, Public Lecture Series, you will find that we have 4 other events coming up this year. So in a change to the advertised lineup, on the 21st of November, we no longer have Soumya Parthasafare, but rather we have her colleague, Dan Ringelstein, who will talk about Arup's international work on urban design. And then after Christmas, we will welcome Hugh Ellis, the policy director from the TCPA, and his colleague Katie Locke to talk about values and planning as the planning system is changing. We then have a Bartlett School of Planning speaker in March, Catalina Turcu, who will talk on her recent research to a title that we have not yet agreed. And then right at the very end, in May of this year, we will have Kim McGuinness, who's the new Labour Metro Mayor for the North East, talk about planning and infrastructure under devolution. So that's the lineup for the rest of the year. So to tonight's speaker, we're very happy to welcome Dr. Tom Moore to UCL. Tom is a senior lecturer in planning at the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Liverpool. So I think you came down today. Staying over this evening. So the main strands of his research are citizen and community participation in the planning and development of the built environment and housing and experiences of inequality and injustice. So his work has been supported by a number of national and international funders, and he brings together those 2 strands in the work that he's been doing on community-led housing, which has been published in a variety of different journals. So if you want to read more about Tom's work, I think you should just Google Tom Moore and community planning. Do you think that will get them to the right places? I think so. So Tom has written very widely about community land trusts, mechanics and processes in different locations. So his talk this evening is focused on community-led housing, and it's titled Community Land Trusts in England, From Movement to a Model. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Nick, and also for the kind invitation. And also thanks to the team at UCL who've been very supportive in arranging this visit. Googling my name and the words community planning probably is the best way to find my work, although when I worked at my previous institution at the University of Sheffield, there was a landscape gardener called Tom Moore's Landscape Community Gardening. And so I did used to get some infrequent emails asking me for quotations to do someone's garden. So be careful who you email. So yeah, thank you to Nick for this invitation. So today I'm going to talk to you about community land trusts in England. I suspect within the audience, when I've given similar sessions to this before, there are a variety of reasons why you, as an individual, may have come to this today. You may have an academic interest in this field, either very specifically to do with community land trusts or more broadly. And I do know there's some people I can see in the audience who certainly fit that bill. You may work or within this kind of field and sector. You may be a volunteer within a community-led housing project as well. So reflecting the diversity or potential diversity of that audience, today I'm going to basically give us a bit of an overview from different perspectives of what is a community land trust, why do we have them, and then talk about some of the kind of political and practical processes which community-led housing and community land trust navigate in order to fulfill their objectives. And I'll talk a bit about what those objectives might be shortly. My own my interest in this area. So I'm now at the University of Liverpool, but back in 2007, when I was completing a master's degree in social policy, I had a strong interest in kind of housing issues, and I came across the concept of community land trusts from an American perspective, which I'll talk about and place in historical context shortly. I subsequently did a PhD on them between 2008 and 2011, and have essentially engaged with this kind of field ever since. Very, very privileged to work on a number of different projects with some really great collaborators. Also really privileged to have been involved in the supervision of some really fantastic PhD students who've studied community-led housing in recent years, and some of whom are cited in this talk today. So while I'm sort of drawing upon many different research projects here to provide a kind of synthesized overview of the kind of state of CLTs in England, I am also drawing on a kind of broader body of work conducted by colleagues, some in the room and some internationally and nationally. I'll begin there with a bit of definitional work, because when you are ingrained or in studying a field for a long period of time, you sometimes assume that everyone has the same kind of understanding of you, and that's not always the case. So what are community land trusts? So community land trusts are described by the national representative body for CLTs, as we may abbreviate them, the CLT network, as democratic non-profit organisations that own and develop land for the benefit of the community. And we'll talk about what the community might constitute shortly. So in essence, it's a model of collective land ownership used to provide affordable housing and potentially other facilities as well, but we're talking about in a housing context today, to provide affordable housing for the benefit of a defined group of people. Perhaps distinguishing it from perhaps other forms of housing provision, they include mechanisms to control affordability, which I'll talk about. They sit within a broader kind of suite of what we might term community-led initiatives, so things like housing cooperatives, which are obviously have a very long and rich history in an English context and European context. Things like co-housing, intentional communities, where people are constructing housing initiatives to group and live together. A broader kind of collection of models that imply high degrees of resident, and that might be residents of actual homes, but also residents of broader communities that imply high degrees of resident participation in the planning, development, and ongoing management and ownership of housing. I think a terminology, I'm doing this partly to provide kind of conceptual clarity, but actually I'm probably oversimplifying things, because in recent years, CLTs have actually kind of aligned with those other models to sort of operate and communicate and articulate their aims, objectives, under this kind of broader kind of banner of community-led housing. So although I'm bracketing this very much around CLTs, some of what I'm talking about today is also kind of transferable and related to the kind of broader pursuit of community leadership and ownership in the planning and development of housing. So just to kind of expand on some of that definitional kind of work, CLTs, what do they do? So essentially, it's a group of people in a geographic community, a community of place, who form and band together to form a legal, formal organisation that acquires land, either through purchasing land or receiving it as a transfer from public authorities. I'll expand on the processes and issues to do with that during this lecture. Once that land is in CLT ownership, they will build housing upon it. That could be self or collective build housing, so people actually building housing themselves. But perhaps more commonly for CLTs, it's built in partnership with relevant professionals. So a community organisation, essentially, non-profit community organisation, commissioning professionals to develop housing that had kind of high degree of influence from the constituent members of the CLT. Those homes that are built and then developed for purchase or for rent, with pricing restrictions in place. So what do we mean by that? We mean, for example, if a CLT is to develop a home for sale, it would be a kind of form of low-cost home ownership, where they may impose kind of restrictions on the percentage of market value that that home is sold and traded and transacted at. Or restrictions on rents, such as social rents and affordable rents. And those restrictions are often enshrined in kind of planning agreements and covenants to prevent any kind of changes to that transaction. So it's very much something that is kind of, as I'll talk about, kind of branded and conceptualized as a response to the inequalities and problems of the housing market. A housing market is very much based on kind of, individualized home ownership, wealth accumulation and speculation. A housing market that is dominated primarily by private house builders. So it's very much about this, often conceptualized as a response to those processes. They're also espoused for promoting and forming models of community governance that valorize resident participation and control. So there's a very strong emphasis on these projects, organizations and projects being initiated by community members. The USA, where this model originated of CLTs, they have this, they kind of valorize this tripartite governance system where they might have a third of the organizational board members drawn from residents of the actual properties that the CLT owns, a third drawn from the broader residential community, and a third from local public authorities and officials. The extent to which that's been adopted in England is variable, and there's not actually very much research on that, but perhaps that's something we can talk about. So why do CLTs exist? Now, I'm not going to spend any time really talking in depth about the housing market and housing problems, because I'm kind of assuming a degree of knowledge about those. And obviously, I've just said a little bit to kind of sit that in context. But CLTs, the origin of them actually very strongly relates to issues to do with racial inequality. So the model of kind of this collective land ownership, which sits in community kind of hands, emerged in the kind of 1960s United States in the context of the civil rights movement, Black Power movements, really, I guess, based upon kind of potentially transformative models of ownership to benefit underserved and marginalized communities who were discriminated against in or experienced kind of structural and economic discrimination. So as De Philippus, a kind of prominent researcher in the USA on CLTs, describes, this is essentially the use of land and community control and ownership of land for politically transformative purposes, essentially empowering marginalized communities. Gradually, retaining some of that ethos, but gradually in the United States developed into a tool to really structure affordable housing provision in the way that I've previously described. And you can find existing CLTs formed in the 1980s and 1990s in places like New York City, in Boston, and Chicago to protect communities. Often from minority groups, but also from low incomes, from concerns of displacement through processes of gentrification and redevelopment and financialized kind of housing and speculative development. I think it's important to say that while representing a very small proportion of housing provision, both in the United States, where CLTs kind of emerged, and in England, they do also kind of sit at the heart of kind of global exchanges for ideas for alternative property development and kind of socialized ownership and collective ownership. So there is, for example, a European Community Land Trust network that has received European funding to kind of build networks between different advocacy organizations in Europe. We can find them we can find similar networks, in North America. We can find CLTs in Rio. So the city council in Rio has recently introduced a kind of policy to promote CLTs and to kind of prevent people being displaced from favelas. So we have a range of different articulations and expressions, globally, and those networks, those communities do talk to one another as well. I've done some research on that, but I'm not going to really dwell too much on that today. So you're probably kind of beginning to kind of understand that there's a range of different ways in which we can conceive and, and think about CLTs. So on one hand, we can think about them as a very pragmatic tool to provide affordable housing, an affordability tool, a correction to market ineffectiveness and the kind of inequalities that have developed through the kind of speculative, privatised, financialised housing market that predominates in England. We have a society that valorises individualised home ownership. Housing relative to incomes is extremely expensive. Cities like London and others, suffer really kind of significant. Create the housing market in cities like London and other places similar, creates significant problems for those on lower to medium incomes. So CLTs, we could conceive of them as this kind of, response to these global challenges confronting local practice that our host today, Nick, has written about. This challenge to the idea of housing as an asset and a vessel for wealth creation, and actually conceiving it more as a community asset. Keeping housing in kind of maintaining housing affordability over time for the benefit of local people who are in housing need. We can also think of them, though, and relate them to political agendas that encourage kind of the engagement of communities in delivery of public services and in broader governance. And I don't think we should necessarily approach CLTs uncritically, and the need for CLTs uncritically. So Helen Jarvis has wrote, obviously, the spatiality of localism is inherently attractive, and some of the things so far that I've said might sound really, really attractive to people who are interested in progressive ideas to challenge conventional logics of the housing market. But equally, this is kind of occurring within a context of public spending cuts, austerity, and actually, we are in a situation where communities are actually the ones being forced into driving local development in response to some of those kind of problems. And whether that's desirable or not might depend on your political viewpoint. Moving from the kind of, or complementing, but also moving away from the kind of more the pragmatic kind of view of CLTs in that context, they are also conceptualized by many people, particularly in the kind of geography literature, around as kind of more radical forms of democracy. So Matthew Thompson, his kind of really detailed, in-depth work on CLTs in Liverpool, highlights, conceived of CLTs as a kind of material resource, but also a kind of social practice. So material resource, they developed obviously the material objects of housing, but actually, it's also a lived process, developing through community. I've kind of briefly already alluded to this, but this whole idea as well that they remove land from the speculative market. So kind of moving from developers' work to the third bullet point there, Meehan's conceptualization of CLTs as part of a new kind of social market, which is conceptually different from the capitalist private market or the bureaucratic state. So it's different from relying on private kind of house builders and developers, but it's also different from asking the government to do things for us. And that all kind of leads to this idea of CLTs and the question as to whether they could represent this kind of post-capitalist housing transition, part of a prefigurative politics, which tries to kind of envision and enact new kind of more radical ways of arranging, of social and economic arrangements and political arrangements. But drawing upon those past, the two slides we spoke to so far, you can quite clearly see that actually CLTs might have different kind of social and political appeal to people on various ends of the kind of spectrum. And Martha Mingue's PhD describes this as a kind of ambiguous categorization of CLTs. Simultaneously, maybe a chat considers a very kind of propositional kind of propositional exercise, envisioning these new ways of kind of owning land and of transacting and protecting housing from the private market, but also simultaneously, sitting within the kind of, the kind of problems and issues we've talked about so far with respect to, the role of community governance and in that kind of context of austerity and reductions in the role of government. So I'm going to kind of just give a kind of potted overview of how CLTs have developed in England, and that will kind of structure the rest of the kind of presentation. So I obviously contextualize their development in the USA, and in the early 2000s, they really emerged in an English context, primarily and initially in rural communities. Rural communities affected by the various problems that plague rural housing markets, high rates of second home ownership, the inability of local young people to afford to live in rural villages, the restrictive nature of the planning system kind of prohibiting or discouraging development in rural places. And so kind of building on and kind of pre-existing structures of community governance, things like parish councils, community development trusts that may own other assets in rural places, there was kind of this kind of period of what we might call like kind of local community experimentation. Interested volunteers, probably involved in the parish council or a community development trust, recognizing local housing problems and wanting to try and do something about it. And kind of simultaneous to this, there was kind of networks of kind of knowledge exchange that resulted from this, from this kind of global influence has kind of been predominant in terms of exchanging and transacting the idea of CLTs from a USA to a British context, has kind of been prevalent since this period, since the very start of CLTs in England. So there was a national demonstration program, which was led by some kind of essentially consultants and experts in the kind of rural community development space, who managed to get some funding from the then Housing Corporation, now Homes England, so the funder of social affordable housing in England. Managed to get some funding to instigate a kind of national demonstration program as to how CLTs from America and that model could be adapted to an English context. And interestingly, given the kind of dynamics and the geographic context that I mentioned about their development in America, but interestingly, that was really kind of looking at how a CLT in Boston or Chicago or New York, how that model could actually fix rural housing problems. So really quite an interesting contrast. There was also during this period, kind of a lot of interest in urban areas. So many of you may be familiar with, for example, the London CLT, which originated from the Citizens UK Community Organising Network. Now that they completed their development in the 2010s, but actually, that was actually kind of the result of many years of community organising and lobbying for a CLT in London. Boris Johnson famously kind of committed to building a CLT on the Olympic Park, despite probably not really knowing what a CLT was, and possibly knowing he will be moving on to grander things at some point. But as I'll talk about in urban areas, the kind of land and finance opportunities are perhaps a little bit more difficult than in rural communities. Around 2010, 2011, we had the advent of localism, and although CLTs, I don't think were ever really formally part of the coalition government and then Conservative government's localism agenda, clearly the general encouragement to try and devolve power and authority to communities, to encourage neighbourhood planning, the general narrative and parameters of the planning system at that time were possibly advantageous to the growth of CLTs as well. So the national demonstration program that I just mentioned resulted in a kind of more formalization of advocacy and lobbying work. So we had these local community groups on the ground, trying to do CLTs. And then in around 2010, 2011, a kind of national CLT network was created. So basically an employed or facilitator, professional, to actually try and give guidance, technical support, and advocacy for CLT groups to try and advance their projects. So in essence, it's the creation of a community-led housing and CLT sector, as it were. And I'm going to talk about the role of these, what we might term infrastructure bodies, shortly. So moving on, so there's kind of mid-teens and bringing us kind of up to date. This is a very whistle-stop tour, but just to kind of articulate where CLTs kind of sit at the moment. So in essence, there is a kind of formalized, professionalized to a degree infrastructure. So we have a national CLT network, a body, professional body that lobbies and influences government on behalf of the concept and ideas of community land trusts. As I'll talk about at a regional level, we also have kind of similar organizations that kind of do a similar kind of thing within a kind of city region on a city region basis. There's been this collaboration with other similar models, so cooperatives, co-housing, so the kind of policy label of community-led housing has developed, and certainly if you Google community-led housing, you'll come up with a raft of different kind of results, including the various national policies that have been created to support community-led development. So in 2016, the government announced a dedicated community housing fund, which I'll talk about in a bit more depth and detail. Community-led development, as in community-led housing and CLTs, is also included in the latest iteration of the National Planning Policy Framework. So you can, hopefully this has given you a flavour of how local community experiments are kind of moving to a more kind of formalised policy kind of position, okay? Recognition from government. You might well be thinking now, if you're not familiar with CLTs and community-led housing, well, what is the scale of this? How many are there? The answer is there's not really any kind of comprehensive data source out there to answer that question. But we're talking obviously a very, very, very small percentage and proportion of housing in England. The typical CLT scheme might be somewhere between 15 and 20 and 30 kind of housing units with kind of variation. But you know, we're not talking about hundreds and thousands here, okay? But there are, I think the CLT network have recently estimated there's over 500 CLT groups in the country. And as we'll talk about throughout the kind of remainder of this talk, there's kind of been a lot more kind of policy experimentation to try and facilitate their growth and development. Just to give you very quickly, I'm not going to talk about these particular projects in great depth and detail, but you know, just to give you a flavour of where CLTs occur and how. So they can range from urban environments, so Home Baked, which is a very prominent example, located near Anfield Football Stadium in Liverpool, which is a shame because I support the other team. That kind of emerged as a response to the failure of housing market renewal. So housing market renewal, for those not familiar, was essentially a top-down state regeneration program that proposed to demolish demolish lots of old houses, Victorian houses in different inner city areas, and then build new housing to correct so-called failing housing markets. It was abandoned halfway through the program, so this CLT kind of emerged from the ashes of that, I suppose. And they are simultaneously a community asset owner. They own a local bakery which produces very, very nice pies and bread. They develop housing, and they're also more of a kind of community anchor organisation, very committed to I guess, articulating the needs of that local community, which is, I think, in the index of multiple deprivation classed as one of the most deprived in the city. We then have rural CLTs, which I've mentioned, tackling these issues, imbalances of supply and demand in rural locations, big rural affordability problems, difficulties for rural housing development, which we don't have the time to go into great depth and detail on, but it's difficult to build affordable housing in rural communities. There are policy mechanisms to enable that, and CLTs have certainly emerged as a way of articulating and representing community views and aspirations for rural housing development. So very, very different kind of geographic settings, right? And I guess this is one of the points of this that I'm making in this presentation, but also one of the difficulties in putting it together is that actually the meaning and practice of community, both what it means to the people starting these projects, but also the place it happens, and therefore the policy mechanisms that support them are really, really diverse. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that concept of community, what it means within a kind of CLT context. So it's a diverse, anyone familiar with the concept of community from an academic standpoint will know that we could spend hours debating this, but in the context of a CLT, yes, it's the site of the intervention. You're developing in and benefiting a defined community and trying to benefit a defined group of beneficiaries in that place. But it's also a process and a goal in and of itself for many communities. I've always really liked this quote, which is from the American CLT literature, so the Institute for Community Economics. who, as you can read through that, and the bit that they emphasise there, a community land trust cannot succeed as something created merely for a community. It must represent an effort of and by the community. And that the success of CLTs should not be judged in terms of, the total acreage of land that they acquire or the total housing units that they develop, but actually more on these kind of, I guess, what you could call softer kind of community benefits that accrue from what they argue is a very democratic way of trying to manage and control and decide upon land use. So CLTs very much have formed around this concept of communities of place. Research on the motivations of CLT volunteers has found that actually the motivations for individuals within CLTs are incredibly variable. Why does someone volunteer their time and capacity to develop one of these initiatives? And actually, while I've been framing this as there's diversity between CLTs, but actually there's diversity within them as well. So, some of the qualitative research I've done with people who've started CLTs, some of them have, been very much driven by pragmatic concerns over housing affordability and the consequence and impact that's had on their local communities. So people being unable to afford housing, often people that they know, or through kind of, 2 or 3 steps removed, but being very aware of the kind of problems and effects that housing unaffordability and lack of supply might be having on their local community. But ranging from that more pragmatic conception, there are others who do definitely kind of, adopt a more utopian vision of these kind of new forms of housing consumption. Very much about, articulating their motivations as being a response to, as I've said earlier, the kind of private market and speculation, and the idea that they think, well, actually land is not something that should be commoditized, but actually protected from speculation and commodification. I put interesting positionality there because actually when speaking to some of those people involved, they are sometimes individual private homeowners themselves. So those starting CLTs are not necessarily the people the eventual beneficiaries, okay? They're not necessarily the people who will live in the homes. So I think there is kind of an interesting kind of positionality there around, people's actions, but also how they're articulating those elsewhere in their life. Community disempowerment, so that might be more to do with concerns and frustrations to do with planning processes. So there's a CLT not too far from me, which is very annoyed with the way in which the local authority makes plans and fails in their eyes to engage with them on the plans for the redevelopment and regeneration of their community. And they see the CLT as a platform really, not just to provide housing actually, but actually as a vehicle and a platform through which they can actually really represent community views and engage with the local authority. And then these ideas around place and community attachment. So, place attachment, which, articulate, is a kind of theoretical work that articulates that people often have kind of social or economic or functional attachments to place. And actually, they do not actually always, those kind of meanings and understandings to place don't actually always reflect, the formal kind of way in which they're defined administratively or by the state. So, for example, in some of the rural communities, there was actually I remember speaking to a CLT which sought to benefit residents from 3 or 4 different villages, which actually straddled local authority boundaries. And actually, they wanted to kind of actually come up with a kind of a kind of multi-village plan, I suppose, for how rural housing could be defined and planned for. So reflecting their kind of community understandings of what place actually means. So a variety of different motivations. So very much this kind of emphasis on communities of place, partly reflecting the rural origins. So rural communities have particular problems and issues that we've briefly mentioned. And I mentioned earlier about kind of pre-existing structures of community governance that would be quite accessible to engage with. Who is a kind of CLT volunteer? Well, often it is someone who might be drawn from what we might term the civic core, so someone who has the time, capacity, knowledge, skill to be able to engage with what might be technical processes of formulating a response to housing problems. And that would apply both in rural and urban settings. So thinking even about some CLTs that I've engaged with in more kind of lower income communities, the people representing CLTs are often still drawn from that kind of civic core. There's been, but despite these kind of rural origins of CLTs, there's also been a big push to kind of try and diversify the sector. So particularly kind of in urban settings, trying to engage with those more complex and diverse understandings of community and how that might be articulated in an urban setting, engaging with communities of interest and identity increasingly as well. Because one of the critiques of community empowerment and devolution of power and responsibility to the so-called civic core is that, generalizing, of course, a little bit, but there is a lot of research that also supports this, is that those people from the civic core do tend to be white, middle class, male, highly educated, retired. The defining attributes of volunteerism, in kind of national surveys, these are kind of often prevalent. And some researchers begin to actually kind of critique this a little bit. So Yael Arbel, who's based at Sheffield Hallam University, and has done some fascinating work on, this is broadening out from CLTs, more about other forms of community-led housing, but I think it's relevant here. But, and how organising around communities of place actually can kind of exacerbate and implicitly exclude other people from other kind of race and or people of other race and ethnicity. Because that civic core is often drawn from those kind of people with different demographic traits. Community-led housing is often kind of developed on a kind of relational and networked basis, which I'm going to mention a little bit shortly. So I won't dwell too much on that, but despite the formalization of policy, a lot of the awareness of community-led housing often depends on who you know and who you speak to. If you find out about a funding opportunity, it's partly communicated and disseminated through these kind of networks, which may implicitly exclude others or unconsciously exclude others. I've been kind of privileged to be involved with a piece of research led by two community-led housing practitioners, Claude Hendricks and Henry Baptiste, looking at the opportunities and challenges for Black and minority ethnic communities in the community-led housing space. And this is actually research that launches tomorrow, so a little bit of a plug, so please get on and download the report when it's launched tomorrow. But this has essentially been looking at underrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic communities in this field. Because, as I've just mentioned, there's been a bit of a concern, I guess the origins of these kind of initiatives have often stemmed from organising around communities of place, and partly having origins in rural communities, which are not always the most diverse. And a lot of policy and strategy that I'm going to talk about has developed really to try and facilitate and build upon that growth, and potentially, excluding other types of community interest in the development of community-led housing. So moving on to talking about how things actually happen. So we have kind of different support structures that have developed for the growth and development of community-led housing. I mentioned earlier about the kind of national infrastructure body, the CLT network, for example. But in essence, responding to some of those kind of challenges associated with undertaking community-led planning initiatives, which is what really CLTs, where CLTs really sit. There's a very large pool of literature which highlights essentially the problems I've just been talking about. Issues to do with do community members have the time and resource, the skills and knowledge, the agency and influence to undertake these efforts, and are they equitably distributed? And there has been a large body of work that's highlighted the role of community planning support groups to help more equitably spread those opportunities among communities. And similar to kind of in the broader community planning area or field, the community-led housing and CLT sector has developed these kind of a network of dedicated secondary support agencies that provide professionalised support to communities. And these are what we might term enabler hubs. So these are basically agencies that do, broadly speaking, the following things. They campaign and lobby on behalf of community land trusts. So that might be to local and regional forms of government, to try and secure funding or preferential policy treatment within planning and policy documents. provide direct support to communities with technical processes of planning, developing, owning, housing, and also trying to diversify the idea of CLTs to different communities to try and tackle some of the problems that I've just talked about. So these would be organisations typically with a couple of staff members, professionals drawn from housing, planning, community development backgrounds. They were really given a stimulus in the mid-2010s through the aforementioned Community Housing Fund, a national government fund that sought to stimulate community-led housing development. And around 26 or 27 formed across the country. There's one in London, the London Community-Led Housing Hub. There was one in Liverpool. It's actually kind of closed down. And that's partly because of problems with funding, which I'll talk about. So they were initially funded partly through grant funding from that fund and from some other charitable funding that was available, and sought to develop kind of more sustainable financial models of development, of organisational development, by, for example, charging fees to communities for the advice that they were giving upon completion of a successful housing development. So a bit of pro bono work up front to facilitate CLTs and community-led housing, but with the idea that when you complete a housing development, sell your homes, you could build in a fee that could be paid to the hub, which could then kind of continue its work and help other communities. So they have a very place-based orientation. So often kind of city regional basis. So there's one covering like Teesside in the northeast. There's one covering Leeds community homes. So that's obviously a city. There's one for the kind of West Country, operating in Bristol, but also supporting neighbouring local authorities. These hubs have been kind of really significant value to groups. I think this is part of the kind of, in my experience, part of the kind of sector that people don't actually really see. They see the kind of headline projects that I've briefly mentioned, but this is a really important part of the process. But I think it also has implications for what we actually mean by CLTs, how they're facilitated, and going back to some of the broader questions at the start around how politically transformative are CLTs, for example. I think the hubs play an important role in trying to understand that. So just to talk about some of their work, very, very briefly, but basically they have been of really significant value, as you can imagine, to communities, particularly those in particularly people in communities with less well-established forms or models of community governance or history in community asset development, helping them with complex legal and financial tasks, how to apply for funding, how to commission an architect and to design housing, these sorts of things. And a really important bridging role between communities and different tiers of government. And analysis of the areas in which hubs have operated has shown that basically you're more likely to find community-led housing there than in an area which doesn't have one, which you might guess, but it has been evidenced. And I think this. I really like this quote, which is actually not talking about CLTs. It's from a study of housing movements in Central and Eastern Europe. But I really like this quote, which talks around the important role of expert activists playing a really key role in translating housing tensions to demands that fit institutional frameworks. And the authors talk about this as being, really a really important ingredient to and condition for politicised expressions of housing problems and proposals or propositions for new housing alternatives. And I think it's a really important part of the narrative and story. And it's especially important if we're thinking about CLTs and community-led housing, because I'm talking about this as a growing and evolving sector. I gave that kind of potted history, which painted this kind of upward trajectory, from local experimentation to an established sector. But actually, what we see today is that much of this institutional framework that I've mentioned, the creation of these regional hubs to liaise and support communities, is actually really beginning to kind of decline and disintegrate due to problems with funding, for example. So the struggle for state sustainability, the second point there, these hubs themselves are financially precarious, right? In essence, they received grant funding with the idea being that would pump prime them to develop a self-sustaining financial business. The reality is that hasn't happened, partly due to the difficulties that CLTs and community-led housing projects face in accessing funding themselves, which I'll briefly talk about shortly. So this kind of precarity of the organisational infrastructure is a really, really significant issue. And what that's actually led to is that some of these hubs are actually beginning to develop their own assets, right? Partly to reflect, need and opportunity for housing development, but also to reflect their own adaptation, because these are professionals, right, who also, they have a job, right, and they want to keep that job. They want to keep the organisation going. They want to keep the organisation going to fulfil its purpose. So there's a bit of a tension between their initial purpose and their strategy for survival. So we talked about community, and the other, community land trusts, the other ingredient to that is land. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about land, its acquisition, its finance and use, and then I'm going to move into some final reflections. So land markets for housing generally, are very, obviously there are geographic variations in this, but can be very competitive. They can be very much driven by market values and the ability to pay more for land than someone else who wants to buy it. There's also problems to do with land availability, particularly in many urban settings. And then there's issues to do with the type of land as well. Is it actually developable and suitable for housing? Now, CLTs acquire land in different ways, and I guess there's kind of three main ways in which you could categorise this. I think of kind of significant importance has been reliance on the public sector, including asset transfer of land from local authorities or other public bodies. Now, that's been a big pillar of successive governments' agendas, encouraging public authorities to review their land stocks, land that sits in their ownership, and encourage and think about how they might creatively dispose of that for housing development. And interestingly, in some cities, Bristol and my own Liverpool, those local authorities have actually devised dedicated policies to dispose of land to community-led housing initiatives, including CLTs, and use so they kind of segregate some land in their ownership and say this is for community-led housing initiatives, and then run a kind of process for which communities can kind of bid for that land. And while they do usually have to pay for it, but there's usually a kind of discounted rate to what the market value might be, due to the kind of social value that could accrue, that they believe could accrue through developing a community-led scheme. Now, of course, I'm not going to pretend and sit here that this land is always necessarily the most desirable land for private developers or the most kind of expensive land that is available, but it does show a really interesting creative way of creating a kind of pathway for alternative forms of housing provision. CLTs also, I would say this is particularly more so in rural areas, but you have the benevolent local landowner who might own lots of land, would probably be unwilling to sell it to a housing association, a housing association perceived to be at a distance from the community and not necessarily working in the benefit of the local community. And there have been many instances in rural communities of landowners, often selling land at a very low rate or even donating it to a community land trust because, out of care and attachment for the community and because of the assurance that it won't subsequently be resold to the highest bidder. And then finally, conventionally funding purchase of land through subsidy or loan finance, but that is increasingly difficult because CLTs are organisations that don't always have a track record or assets to borrow against. So a variety of different ways, and then there are policy mechanisms. So in rural areas, there are access to land through rural exception sites. So sites that would not usually be developed or released for housing, but are for small-scale projects that benefit local communities. Those sorts of policy mechanisms aren't quite so obvious in urban areas, and raises an interesting question for people in urban communities to think around organisation of the CLT concept. Is it focused on a particular piece of land which may or may not be attainable, or is it more around the logic and concept and picking up land wherever you can find it? So just to kind of build on the funding argument here, so there's a difficulty of obtaining loan finance that I've mentioned. The government housing fund that I mentioned, well, it says 2016 to 21 there, but actually it was it kind of closed in 2021. I don't think all the money was ever drawn down because the government kept closing and reopening it for unknown reasons, political reasons possibly, I'm not sure. It was never really disclosed or documented, but in essence, although that was said, it was suggests it was a 5-year funding program dedicated to community-led housing. It wasn't actually, funding wasn't available for all 5 of those years. It was also originally allocated in response to the origins of CLT growth. So when the Community Housing Fund was announced, I think they said they would fund it to the tune of 60 million a year. And a third of that was given to CLTs that were located in areas of high second home ownership, which, well, there's a correlation between high second home ownership and rural communities. So actually, and a recent review conducted by the CLT network suggested that 50% of projects or more that were funded through this fund were actually based in the southwest and southeast. So a real kind of geographic concentration. And if we think about whether that funding was directed to urban communities or diverse communities, there is kind of evidence to suggest it was probably more directed towards rural environments. CLTs can access this kind of general affordable housing subsidy given by Homes England, which funds housing associations, but that arrives with different regulatory requirements as to how you use public money, which has kind of pushed a lot of CLTs into partnering with housing associations to develop housing. So this has created kind of replicable models of delivery. So a kind of classic one is where a CLT will own the land and essentially lease it to a housing association to develop housing on that, and then manage and rent out the housing. And in that circumstance, the housing association will pay a ground rent to the CLT, so the CLT is accruing an income, but the housing association will accrue the rental income and manage the properties accordingly. So there's a sharing of risk and responsibility, but also reward. And some of the kind of literature around CLTs often talks about their ability to capture the value of land and housing, and to kind of use that, then you also use that for community-orientated and politically transformative purposes. And I think in that model, you could question whether actually probably more aligns the idea of CLTs with a more pragmatic understanding of what they are for. So, there are impacts on community control there, and, a kind of relation and affecting perhaps the relationship between motivation and aspiration, compromise essentially. Then thinking about the actual housing that has been developed, sadly, there are no kind of comprehensive data sources that we can just kind of Google and pick up and present you some nice statistics here. But different kind of piecemeal research has highlighted that CLTs actually in England might have a greater emphasis on social and affordable rent than the kind of traditional model of low-cost home ownership, resale restricted ownership that we talked about. That perhaps reflects that lots of them have been funded through Homes England or the Community Housing Fund and through partnerships with housing associations. Where they have developed and sold housing, as I mentioned at the very start, a kind of conventional model for doing that and trying to maintain affordability over time has been to tie the value of the property and to enshrine that in a kind of planning covenant to market value. So basically, that, for example, selling homes for, say, a third of market value. I know one CLT that's done that. And then subsequent resale is limited to that proportion as well. So if you buy one of those properties, you can only ever sell it for the same percentage of market value that you purchased. And I think that's a really interesting model, but it also ties conceptions of affordability or definitions of affordability to whatever the market is dictating there, right? Housing allocations, who lives in CLT homes? So there's a combination of assessments of need when allocating a CLT home. And partly it depends on who's funding it. But I think it's really important to stress that while these homes are typically directed to people in economic need, local connections are also a really significant driver and motivator, really significant allocations policies and really significant driver for those involved in forming CLTs. And their involvement, participation, leadership of CLTs is often really contingent on those being met. So put simply, I have interviewed and spoken with CLT activists, practitioners who have said that if they could not guarantee that homes would be allocated to people with connections to their local community, they wouldn't get involved. They wouldn't do it, right? They would not get involved. Now, that's not everyone. It's not every individual. It's not every CLT. But I think, and if we look at allocations policies, they often really stress this idea of local connection and tie the kind of understanding of need to that. And so that's why, when we're thinking about some of the kind of earlier kind of propositions, we begin to think about what a CLT is here to achieve. It can be both of these, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, of course, but the development of affordable housing tenures to challenge a system, or is it to provide for a kind of defined group of beneficiaries? And while they're not mutually exclusive, I think it is important that we kind of situate and try to understand that kind of diversity in motivation and aspiration. And I think related to that as well, there's been a really interesting kind of advancement among some CLTs of cross-subsidising the development of the affordable housing provision they wish to develop by developing homes for the private market, partly reflective of a difficult financial climate, difficulties in accessing public subsidy, the inability to access the kind of loan finance at affordable interest rates. But also, partly that might also be reflective of, the difficulty of trying to correct, remedy, challenge housing and land commodification processes. Simultaneously critiquing a market while actually also relying upon it and therefore, relying upon it to try and fund your own activities. So just a couple of kind of reflections to bring this to a close. I suppose through this kind of narrative and history, I suppose, of the CLT development, I'm trying to highlight, the oppositional nature that some CLTs have to conventional ways in which housing is planned for, provided, and transacted. But also the interdependent relationship that exists between the motivations and attributes of CLTs. And this kind of the extent to which they are actually able to challenge these dominant exchange value logics that some would argue characterize our housing system in the context of, a system where there's very little funding and perhaps very little agency available to communities to do that without, as this quote here says, reproducing the structural and socioeconomic conditions that actually feed those problems. So, in my research, for example, I would say that I haven't really encountered many CLT activists who actually question the need for CLTs in the first place and the need for affordable housing, right? And questioning that dominant system and those logics. But there will be variation between that, and there might be people in the room who completely disagree with me, and that's fine. And I look forward to the debate. I think a really interesting question as well, particularly at this period, is where do CLTs sit politically? You can really, I came into this, 15 odd years ago, really interested by the kind of challenge to kind of privatise housing market forces, but quickly became aware that, I spoke to kind of activists who actually loved Eric Pickles and were, really, supportive of his idea of, let's demolish government and actually empower communities to do things. And that created a few questions in my head. So the CLTs sit on kind of, can appeal to both ends of the political spectrum. Whether that's, an interest in small government, reduced bureaucracy, more responsibility to non-state actors to take responsibility for public issues, but also, at the other end, more kind of progressive solutions to market problems. And, I think when, some of the kind of literature that I would argue is quite celebratory of the alternative potential of CLTs, I would argue, as you're probably gathering, that we have to understand the kind of situation of them within a system that, perpetuates and promotes these market-based logics, right? And CLTs, CLT residents themselves sit within this market framework. If you want to buy a CLT home, resale restricted or not, you need to be able to get a mortgage. You need to be able to participate in that system. There's regulation and funding constraints that encourage partnership with the mainstream actors, housing associations, that many CLTs might have been set up to challenge. And I think it's important as well because many sector actors might try and promote that kind of partnership model with communities and more professionalised actors and professionalised relationships. But actually some communities are forming CLTs in response to problems with those professionalised actors, problems with housing associations, problems with private developers. So that kind of reliance and how that's balanced, and how that kind of is balanced between this kind of radical potential of CLTs versus a more mainstreaming institutionalization is a really interesting thing to try and explore. But finally, perhaps quite positively, CLTs are kind of, you could argue, are achieving more incremental systemic change. So in recent years, there's been a big debate about the use of leaseholds in the private market. So where private actors are selling leaseholds and charging people ridiculous ground rents. Now many CLTs actually use that model as well. Actually, they will retain the freehold to land, but sell the leasehold to the occupier. But do so at a more affordable rate. And they've actually successfully lobbied to be exempt from the leasehold ban that the previous government was introducing. So almost kind of exempting them and removing them from some of those kind of regulatory forces. And then finally, this is my final slide, there are some kind of rhetorical or existential questions there at the top, which I can let you read. But I think it's also really interesting to note how this varies, the articulation of this idea varies internationally. So I spent some time in Paris earlier this year, meeting with some people who are involved in CLTs in France. And actually when I arrived and actually spoke to them in depth and detail, I found out it's actually CLT without the C. So in essence, it's actually municipalities, they're equivalent to housing associations, who actually are developing resale restricted housing, with planning covenants in place to protect it and to so-called keep it affordable in perpetuity, that are doing so with the kind of support of a kind of national government-backed specialised financial vehicle that gives them low-cost finance to do that. So it's essentially the same financial model, it's just without the C, without the community. In North America, there's a really strong and very explicit focus on the politically transformative potential of CLTs to tackle issues to do with racial equity and a reaction to land dispossession. Now, it's in some, not all. It's obviously a very big content, but it's the National CLT Conference there is actually explicitly promoted on those grounds, for example. So there's a real contrast and variation in these more pragmatic and utopian aspirations for how the CLT model is articulated. And I think it will be really fascinating to track how that might evolve and change in England following this period of what we could term precarious growth. Now, thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions and yeah, hope you found that interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for a very comprehensive talk this evening. But do we have any questions?
Hello, hi. Iqbal Hamiduddin, I'm an academic here. Thanks very much for that. I just wondered if you could just say a little bit more about where we are politically now. You said a few interesting things about that sort of big society, localist agenda and how this sort of movement flourished, sort of 10 years, 15 years ago. What's the music now then, do you sense, from government and indeed local authorities for supporting CLTs?
Yeah, great question. So I think we can distinguish between different tiers of government here. But nationally, Labour have not really shown much interest, to be honest. I think if you Google, the different policy statements that various politicians have made before and since the election, community-led housing, as they kind of to use the kind of policy label, doesn't really feature. So my own take on Labour's aspirations is that they're a bit more of a facilitation and still a great emphasis on the role of the private sector to deliver this 1.5 million homes. So they're obviously really interested in scale, which I think is detrimental to the idea of supporting community-led initiative. But at a more local and regional level, so yeah, that's something I probably should have actually talked about in a bit more detail. So I mentioned about the local authority policies encouraging land transfers, but at combined authority level as well, there's again, variable, but there's quite a lot of interest in some city region areas around facilitating community-led housing. And that does kind of correlate with where there's interest in local authorities, so Liverpool, Leeds, for example. However, I think one challenge has actually been, this is more anecdotal to be honest, but one challenge speaking to people in these networks and other researchers is that that policy support at a regional and local level is not always enshrined in actual official documentation and policy and strategy. And it's often actually quite reliant on what you might term champions within those authorities who are taking quite a, who for various reasons may see the potential of these initiatives and be willing to try and champion their kind of implementation. But what that means is that actually CLTs or CLH might not be fully embedded, and if those people move on, and that's happened in a few areas actually, if those individuals move on, those champions move on, the kind of connection between the local projects and enablers and the actual policy and strategy people is kind of lost. So precarious again, I would say.
Okay, I'll take another question in a moment. Tom, I'm a very simplistic soul, as you know. I imagine that 3 impediments to community land trusts are planning, maybe, raising the finance, and acquiring the land, because obviously, land has to be acquired in a very constrained, very competitive market. I mean, you and I know that land markets are very different down here in London compared to other parts of the United Kingdom. But of those, if you think about those 3 impediments, which is the greatest? And order them. No, actually, please order them, yeah? And tell me what we need to do to overcome each.
So planning, finance, and land,
Yeah.
Okay, ordering them. So I like that question because my get out is always geography matters, but you're really trying to force me there, right? So I would say funding, first of all. I think that if, based on research we've done, I think if you are setting up a community land trust, you need an identifiable source of funding. You need to know that you can actually fund your ideas. You also need support from the enabler hubs that I mentioned, the institutional professionalised framework, which also doesn't have much funding or has precarious funding. The second, I would say, is land. I'm saying that's second because it's the chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? But I think you need funding to access land, regardless. And I also would put that behind funding because I do think that even in London, for example, so the GLA have had the small site, small builders scheme, trying to encourage diversification of house builders and housing supply. Now, I'm not saying necessarily those parcels of land are always the most optimal or the most suitable or always go to community projects, but they are it is an opportunity. And the third, it's interesting you say this, planning. So I teach planning students, and I regularly bemoan to them government critiques of the planning system and its speed and so-called inefficiency, because I often point out that many planning authorities and planning departments have had significant resource cuts. Now, of course, there's 2 bits here. Like there's a kind of a speed thing and then there's a policy bit. But I think, I personally think that planning would be the least problematic of those 3 issues. But what's really interesting is I'm not going to name them, I follow some community, I'm connected on LinkedIn with some community-led housing practitioners who regularly bemoan the planning profession and regularly bemoan its denial of kind of community building opportunities. But I think overall, in rural communities, we have opportunities for land development through rural exception sites where appropriate. And in some urban communities, there are planning policies, supplementary planning guidance, for example, that's been developed to try and facilitate CLTs and CLH. So I would probably rank planning the least there. But someone can possibly tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, my name is Luca Zombach. I'm just started a PhD on new towns and community stewardship. So kind of interesting that place between the national scale at the moment with a new towns program and also looking at community stewardship and ownership, because I'm looking for what is the potential really in that larger scale to bring in that community-led development into the discussion, especially, as you said, the Labour government maybe hasn't shown that much interest at this stage. I did see the first meeting of the New Towns Task Force includes mostly public sector and private sector actors, big actors. TCPA is also on the board, but not really much on the side of community actors, but I mean, is it potentially, in your view, do you think it is also an opportunity at this stage to bring that into the discussion, or should it be part of the discussion?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's opportunities like this. So if the community-led housing is to scale up, I haven't really used that phrase much, but that's often used in the professional and practice kind of sector. You know, they want to scale these initiatives up, and realistically, that will probably only be done through partnerships or growth opportunities like the construction of new settlements, such as new towns. Do I think communities should be involved in that? Yes, I do. So as a kind of basic personal principle, I think I'm a fan of community empowerment and involvement. The problem with a CLT, of course, is that, you know, if in the context of a new town, CLTs are often created by people already living in a community, existing residents who recognise a problem and have an appetite to develop these organisations and initiatives in a new town, and there possibly isn't an existing community to build upon. But I think what's interesting as well, though, is that, you know, if we think about the garden city ideas as well, so actually I would really orientate less from the community model in that particular scenario, but more towards those kind of opportunities that kind of economic model could provide. You know, so how can you capture land values to provide more equitably forms of housing, but also with a kind of provision and amenities within communities, and, you know, Letchworth and so on is really interesting because a lot of the early CLT literature often referenced them, you know, in terms of capturing land value and reinvesting it into a local community. These days, I don't think that's really referenced, or those parallels are drawn very much. But I would say really it's those sort of economic models that I would see as the potential in new towns, as opposed to necessarily the community element, if that makes sense. Thanks for the question.
Hello, my name is, William Walton. I'm an academic also in the department. You mentioned the United States. In the United States, there is a culture of and a history of these large foundations like the Ford Foundation, where essentially their system is geared to these companies giving large amounts of money to trusts, charitable trusts, and obviously there are tax benefits of this. Could you envisage, or would you support some sort of major changes in this country to encourage the capitalists, the large companies, to be able to give away large amounts of money that would actually help fund the sort of trusts you're talking about?
My name's Liam Curran. I'm doing a master's in spatial planning, and I think, you know, I've seen local examples where I live in South East London of community land trust, and they're excellent examples and successful use of odd bits of land, you know, that nobody else can do anything with them. But going back to the scaling up issue, isn't this always going to be a niche, a very small niche thing as it is at the moment? Because how could it be scaled up to be a significant contributor to tackling the housing problem? You'd have to have council housing on a big scale again, or the new towns, something like that. So is it doomed to remain a niche?
Thank you. I'm Vanwy Taylor, a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Planning. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it and learnt a lot. Thank you. I just wanted to raise the issue of sort of workspace, low-cost workspace. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but in London this year, the East End Trades Guild sort of made a policy proposition in their manifesto to the Mayor of London saying they wanted policy support for community land trusts and social value leases as a kind of policy solution to what we're calling London's workspace crisis. It doesn't just have a housing crisis, it now has a workspace crisis. So just wondering if you're aware of any other similar demands in other cities or towns in the UK. I mean, I'm aware the sort of differences you draw out in terms of the US model and the values of the US model, that there is a much more developed discourse and understanding of the importance of like asset ownership, collective asset ownership, whether residential or commercial, to racialized communities. But I don't, you know, I'd be interested in your perspective as to whether we see such a shift in the UK. Thank you.
Great. Am I okay to go, Nick?
Yes, go ahead.
All
Go on.
systems go. Can I take them in reverse order, if that's okay? So thank you for that question around affordable workspace. There's two things I'll say in response to that. I'm not necessarily familiar with the context of workspace, but I am familiar with the use of the CLT model and organisations calling themselves CLTs with respect to things like protection of, like, I guess, heritage of a small H, so I'm not talking about listed buildings, but for example, near me, there's an old building that has quite significant maritime history, which is dilapidated, and there's a CLT that's formed to basically try and renovate that and turn it into an educational facility. So I think it is a model that is adaptable to a variety of different kind of needs. So I would also suggest that possibly that sort of thing exists, but it also doesn't call itself a CLT. And certainly I think the CLT network and the infrastructure that I've mentioned are very much focused on housing issues. If you Google them, they're very much focused on, how can policy be changed to help them deliver housing. But clearly, it's an adaptable model. And just on the point about discourses of collective ownership, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, a really important point, and I think one of the challenges, and possibly leading on to the next question about is it doomed to remain a niche, is that in this country, we do conceive of housing as an individualised asset. Housing isn't an asset also that necessarily lends itself easily to be understood as something that is shared, and not necessarily as in you and I sharing a house. I'm not suggesting that, but a shared asset for the community, right? And I do think that the kind of that discourse isn't very well entrenched or very visible in our society is ultimately a barrier. So thank you for your question. Moving on to the second question, the middle question around, is it doomed to remain a niche? I think it depends. What do we anticipate? What do we think this should or could look like in 10 to 15 years or however long, right? And I think if you speak or look at professionals in the sector, they talk numeric terms around the X thousands of homes that could be unlocked and built if the government put in appropriate policy and funding and strategy to facilitate them. More pragmatically, I suspect it probably will remain a niche, but I also don't necessarily think that is problematic, because I think for where it develops in those communities, it's often really significant value, and particularly in terms of articulating the interests for communities of interest and identity. So, for example, in Liverpool near me, it's a CLT that is formed and developed in an area, where the black community has traditionally lived, been subject to a lot of kind of injustice and discrimination over the years, and they feel they've been kind of forced out through processes of redevelopment and regeneration. So at that localized level, although it's a niche, it's playing a really important role for those communities. So to put my colours to the mast, I would say, yes, I think it probably will remain a niche, because I think the idea of overcoming the kind of systemic issues and the discourse that we just talked about is really, really challenging. And finally, would I be supportive of working with the capitalists? That's a really good question. That's the reason why I saved this one to last, because I didn't want to answer it. So I think you're right, there's a kind of a cultural kind of difference between us in the United States. But the question you asked was, would I be supportive of essentially large corporations being able, presumably, to perhaps realise some tax benefits if they were to make a bit of a payment over to the community bodies? We essentially operate on that model in the planning system already in some respects. We let private developers kind of build private speculative housing developments and profit from that if they pay a community infrastructure levy. So yes, I probably would be supportive of that. I'm a pragmatist. I don't necessarily also think whether that's also dedicated to CLTs. I think that's another debate, because I think it also depends on what we're trying to achieve. Because I think, as our colleague said, to really overcome housing problems and housing supply and affordability issues, it's going to take large scale, the last time every government says they want to build 300,000 homes a year. They haven't done it since the 1960s, and the last time they did it, the public sector was actually one of the, I don't know, I think it was the biggest house builder. So realistically, I think you have to work with the private market, you have to work with the capitalist market. Whether or not CLTs are the best avenues to do that, that's possibly another debate.
Great, thank you. I've got 5 more questions lined up, and they will be the last 5. So if I've nodded at you, you are one of the 5. We're also at that time in the evening when I say, please keep your questions very succinct.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Ingrid, and I'm a final year student, undergraduate. So my question relies on the planar triangle, so the economic, social, and environmental kind of network. And I think you covered the economics and social aspects of CLTs very well. But I was wondering, because social and environmental issues are very hard to reconcile, especially in housing, how are community land trusts incorporating sustainability, like defined in this case as net zero or circular economy principles, and how can they further develop in this area?
Hi, thank you for today. It was very useful. My name is Gunnar. I'm studying housing and city planning. So these community land trusts, it really seems like something useful for housing crisis. But my question is very simple. Basically, are they considered as limited companies or charities or I don't know, non-profits? And do we have enough evidence? Because you mentioned that we started since the beginning of 2000s. Do we have enough evidence? Are they successful? Because you said they keep the freehold and they lease it. The leases goes up to 900 years. And if those people, couple of people who form these land trusts, if anything happens to them, what happens to the ownership of the land? Thank you.
We are in the 21st century at a very special time as far as new towns are concerned. The government has committed to a program of new towns. There has been some experience in the past of trying to accommodate community land trusts in new towns. Land is the key to a community land trust. Why are you so pessimistic about whether community land trust initiatives could feature in the new towns? There's nothing to stop the task force allocating 10, 20, 30% of the new land for community land trust initiatives. If they did, would there be a take-up of that land from communities of place or communities of interest?
Okay, there are your questions.
Okay, wonderful. So I will take them in order this time. So on sustainability, yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question. I have a bit of a disappointing answer in that I'm not saying they're not, but I don't think there's kind of a direct correlation or association between CLTs and achieving net zero, for example. And you see that in the promotional kind of literature or headlines. Nevertheless, and I can try and find the reference, but I can't remember it off the spot. But I am aware of some people, researchers, that have argued that CLTs deliver more environmentally friendly and sustainable housing. And I'm also aware of several activists who would definitely be driven by and aligned with many of those objectives and agendas. A bit of a vague response, I apologise, but I think it's a really important question, and I think actually it's a really important avenue for potentially future research, because as we know, many community initiatives are also interested in contributing to those kind of goals. The question around company status, that's really straightforward. So some of them register as charities, some don't, because that creates, the governance and regulation of charities is very tight. They're very, very regulated in terms of the activities they can do. But others would register as what are known as like industrial provident societies. And basically these are organizations which have legal kind of commitments to non-profit status and recycling of income and revenue, for the purposes of that organisation, rather than individuals extracting kind of private dividends or profit. I think you were asking about success, and I interpreted that as to mean kind of affordability, like, this kind of idea of affordability maintained over time. We don't really have data on that to kind of to give it. I don't have data, and not aware of any research that has explored that in terms of how CLT homes will be subsequently transacted, which I think is what you were kind of asking. However, in the United States, there actually is quite a lot because of the longevity of the model over there. They've done some quite technical studies, economic studies, which have suggested that CLT homes actually become more affordable over time. I think if you Google about that, there's quite a lot of research that's been done on that by US scholars. So there is evidence over there that they are a really important contributor to affordable housing provision. But here we don't really have the data. And actually, I think this will be a really interesting thing to explore. What does it mean to live in a CLT property, to go on and transact that? Residents, occupants benefit when they access a home at a discounted market rate. But how do they actually feel when actually 10, 15 years time and they see their neighbour or someone down the road selling their property for X amount, and then they're obviously constrained by the kind of the regulations that are in place. I think that would be a really interesting thing to consider. But we don't yet have the kind of evidence or data to look at that. Thank you for your question. It's interesting you described me as pessimistic, because I didn't actually think I was, but clearly, clearly I was, or interpreted that way. You are right. There is nothing to stop the task force from doing that. I think it is more likely. So the reason why I didn't think I was pessimistic is because I was trying to suggest that the economic principles by which CLTs operate, I think, are adaptable and could be incorporated within the proposed new towns, right? I guess that's what I was trying to say. But I think the way we currently conceive of CLTs is that, you and I live in a community and we recognise there's a problem and a need for an organisation like that, and we put in the effort and form to organise around that. What you're suggesting there would be a different approach. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think, if the task force were to, designate a percentage of land and then invite proposals and tenders, things like that, which then could, mirroring the local authority policies I mentioned, that, incorporate measures of social value into those, that could be a really interesting approach. Do I think it will happen? Probably not, if I'm being totally honest. So there is my ingrained pessimism coming out. But I do think, as I say, just to reiterate, I do think the economic principles are certainly adaptable, certainly transferable. Perhaps it's on academics, practitioners, activists to be making the case more strongly to try and have those things accommodated and incorporated into these ideas. Because, to bring it back to some of the earlier questions, realistically, those opportunities are the only, well, not the only, but possibly the most fruitful opportunity for things like this to be, and both the community and market logics that these models promote, probably the only opportunity for which they could be scaled up. Yeah. But thanks for an interesting question.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that there are 3 more questions, and I remember who you are, but could I ask if we could save those questions for the reception? Directly to Tom. So, Tom, thank you very much for a fascinating talk this evening. Thanks to everybody in the audience for their questions. But in the meantime, could we thank Tom in the traditional manner?